All right, good evening, Barnegat. We'll give her a second for a couple of people to jump on here. I see the numbers coming up, and then we'll get started. Hi, Marta. Hey, Brandy. What's up, Dave? And Marie. Stephanie. Angie. Steven, right out of the gate with the questions. All right, everybody. We'll get going. Obviously, it's been we're about a month since our last Facebook Live. Obviously, a lot of things have changed in that time, both in and around COVID and otherwise in the profession. So we'll go ahead and get started with the COVID numbers first. So we're sitting at we're sitting at 261 cases right now. That's total cases we've had since the beginning. So many of those 261 have recovered. We're at 12 deaths. So the exact active number I don't have from the health department, but it's significantly less than what it was when we were back in the peak a couple of months ago. What we're seeing now is several days, sometimes 3, 4, 5 days strung together with no positive test results at all. So we look last week we went through 3, 4 days with no positives. We picked up 3 last Saturday, and then we went Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday with no positives. We picked up 2 today. So again, the numbers are way down. We're at a doubling rate of well over a month. I'm sorry, well over 2 months now. You look back, we were at 126 cases on April 15th. So sitting at about 261 now. So about double from where we were 2 months ago, but certainly obviously a lot slower spread than we had in the beginning. So we'll segue from that right into everything being opened up. We know that outdoor dining started this week. You can see if you're driving around town, several of our establishments took advantage of the new resolution that the township put into place, set up outdoor dining. We facilitated some safety checks so they could have their awnings set up so you don't have to dine in the sun. We'll hit the graduation issue up top. So I know that's been a lot of discussion. A lot of discussions with Dr. Latwis, looking at what the school district is trying to get done. There's a lot of questions with this 500 person limit that's anticipated on July 3rd, and whether that 500 person limit in the venue of a graduation, a high school graduation, would that apply to a group of kids on the field being one number, and then people who are distant in the bleachers or the stands being another number? We ran that request up through state OEM, and they put it through the Attorney General's office, and they got back to us this week and said that the 500 number, when it goes into effect, will be for the event as a whole. So it's not going to matter whether people are standing around the fence, in the stands, on the field. We're limited to 500. So again, we tried to see if we could get the state to agree to split those locations, but in the end they did not. So that's the latest and greatest from at least from our end on the graduation front. You'll remember, I just want to cover a couple of crime-related things. You remember back on June 1st, we had a fire at Shoreline Sand and Gravel in the pit there. Our detective bureau did a great job with that case in combination with our uniformed patrol officers, and actually one of our officers who was off duty in the area and ended up identifying a couple individuals who were leaving the area shortly after the fire. So that resulted in 4 people being charged, 4 juveniles. 16, 3 of them were 16, one of them was 15, 3 of them Barnegat kids, and one of them a Stafford resident. So that case has been cleared. So great job by all the investigators and officers involved in that one, and of course our partners up at the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office who were integral in that as well. At the same rate, we'll often talk about the crime reduction unit and the job the crew is doing in town with the drug offenses. In May, well, let's roll back before May. When we came through March and April with everything going on with COVID, we had repurposed crew. One of our concerns was that with all these vacant businesses, all these businesses being closed down, that there was an increased risk for commercial burglaries. Obviously, people who were still working, leaving the home, worried about daytime residential burglaries. So I didn't talk about it then for obvious reasons, but what we did then was we essentially repurposed crew. Again, the advantage of having a unit like that is everyone who's in there is an outstanding police officer. It's a high bar to get into that unit, and they're really skilled and they're really adaptable. So we took them and changed their mission in the short term and had them go out to address those essentially security-based issues to help secure our businesses and residences in town and places that we were concerned about an uptick. I don't think it's any coincidence that we didn't see an uptick in crime during that period of time when other places did. So that being said, as we rolled into May, we don't want to divert attention away from the crime issues for too long. So crew was put back to their normal mission as we rolled back to the full patrol staffing. And in the month of May, they made 23 arrests. So clearly got back after it, and those are mostly arrests for cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, both possession and distribution. So again, a great job being done by the members in the team in our crime reduction unit. Looking at the call for service data that we try to talk about every time here. When we look at June to date versus May, same period, we see that we are definitely getting busy and getting into our summer swing here. We've talked those domestic violence calls that we saw really spike early in COVID during the stay-at-home. We saw them plane out a little bit, and now typically the time of year when we get busier again, we see them go up, and this year is no different. So our DV calls June versus May are up 67% so far month to date. First aid calls up 34%. Our motor vehicle crashes down a little bit from last month, down 12%, and overall call volume, so all calls for service, up 25% in June versus May. So a really significant uptick in calls for service. It's getting busy around here again. If we look at June to date this year versus June of 2019, same period, we see our total calls are up 12% even versus last June. So no two ways about it. We've been busy and hopping here this month. So, and the numbers show that. So that's everything we have on the statistic front. I'm going to talk about obviously because it's relevant with everything going on in law enforcement right now, and I'll talk about it because it was asked, I believe, in our last session. The question was brought up: what do the Barnegat police officers do? What does the department do to have accountability and monitor any racial bias within the agency and how we police? So I want to run down a lot of what we do here, just to give you a view of how we make sure that we stay on top of that. So I'm going to start with the hiring process here, because at the end of the day, when we really boil down to what we want, if you want good cops, you need to hire good people, right? So just the entire hiring process and the way we vet our employees, both through the background check, through the psychological screening, and very importantly through the in-person interview process, we've gotten good at identifying the good people. And our last, certainly dozen hires are a great example of that. We've got a lot of great officers up and coming in this department, and obviously a lot of the officers that have been around here for a long time are great officers. So we continue to focus on hiring good people, right? That's square one. I'll talk about this kind of paralleling what the Attorney General's office is doing. you'll hear a term early warning system, right? That's a big thing in law enforcement right now on the progressive front of things. So the Attorney General came out in March of 2018 and mandated that all the departments in the state had to have an early warning system in place. So basically what an early warning system is, it's a way for us to track and monitor certain types of incidents, because if we see a couple of these incidents strung together, it's a red flag for us that, hey, we want to go talk to this officer and find out why has this officer had, X number of use of force incidents in a certain amount of time. Why have they had a number of incidents maybe where an arrestee was injured that they were handling. So we use that as an indicator so that it's kind of a flag for us to dig a little deeper and see if there's an issue there. So think about that. When the Attorney General did it back in March of 2018, was considered a progressive thing to put out a statewide directive on that. So what I'm proud to say about how we do things here is that we instituted an early warning system that is actually much more demanding and rigorous than the one that the Attorney General put out. And we put that system into place in January of 2010. So as the state is rolling this out as a new initiative, our PD is already a decade into this, already a decade into doing this here. And that's actually a product, you hear me talk a lot about CALIA and international accreditation. That's what essentially forced us to go to an early warning system a long time ago. That's a requirement within CALIA. So when you see something that's being held up as progressive in 2018, understand that's been going on here since 2010, almost a decade into it. So, and again, the policy that we have in place here, which you can find online, is much more robust, tracks way more incidents than what the AG's directive requires us to track. So that's something that we've been above and beyond for a long time. Question comes up, and that's an issue you probably have heard the Attorney General talk about over the last week or two, is both crisis intervention training and de-escalation training. So we talk about that being a new thing in law enforcement. It's not a new thing here. We have emphasized de-escalation for a long time, way before it was the popular hot button word of the day. Going all the way back to 2017, so 3 years ago, when the crisis intervention team training came out. And what crisis intervention training is essentially police officers get tasked with handling a lot of problems now that we didn't historically handle, right? Police departments become the bottom of the funnel for society's problems. So when we look at issues like substance abuse problems, mental health problems, when there's no other social structure to handle those, it falls on the police department. And you'll see a lot of use of force incidents, and especially these deadly use of force incidents, typically are connected with people in mental health crisis, right? They're things that years ago police weren't even handling, that now they're being tasked to handle. So crisis intervention training essentially pairs our police officers with mental health professionals, where they learn strategies for dealing with people in mental health crisis and how to de-escalate those situations so we don't end up using force when it's not necessary, right? So whereas some agencies maybe participate, send a couple of officers to crisis intervention training, we had our entire department trained in crisis intervention training starting back in 2017, right? That's every officer. And not just classroom training, but actually scenario-based training. So our crisis intervention trainers are training the officers in the technique, and then we're putting them in high-stress scenarios to evaluate their ability to execute on that training. So big difference between sitting in the classroom just learning it and when you have to actually go out and perform it under pressure. I don't think it's any coincidence that our use of force rates, and I'll get into this in a minute, are as low as they are here, because we have officers who work in a culture where de-escalation training and crisis intervention training is really a central primary function of what they're doing. And our officers are, I will say it proudly and unabashedly, our officers are excellent at de-escalating situations. And the numbers are gonna show that shortly. So next thing we do, I talked about this a little bit last week, was we instituted a body-worn camera program back in 2018, March of 2018. And again, in always trying to go really above and beyond, a lot of the things that you'll see as criticisms of body-worn camera programs, we addressed here in policy and practice. Our officers have to activate their cameras anytime they're taking an official action. So it's not just on a call where maybe there's a potential for there to be physical force. It's not just on a domestic violence call or a mental health crisis call where we know there's a potential for increased tensions and potential use of force. They have to turn it on every single time they're taking any kind of official police action, right? How do we have accountability and make sure that they're doing that? Well, one, obviously, it's by having our first line supervisors out there to monitor it. But two, it's, and I talked about this last time, our first line supervisors every month are tasked with reviewing body-worn camera video randomly of the officers that they're responsible for, up to 2 hours a month for each officer. So we're making sure that they're turning it on, and then beyond that, we're actually watching the call for service and ensuring that the officer handled it properly. And sometimes the officers, the supervisors, will find things that can be improved, things that can become training issues. We identify problems as maybe supervisors and commanders that we didn't know existed because we're not physically there on the call. So again, that's a piece or a pillar of how we try to maintain this accountability and professionalism here. And then I'll talk about use of force analysis, which is another thing. And yep, I see your comment there, Stephen. I'm getting blind in my old age, but I'll circle back to that. So our officers have very strict set of guidelines when they can turn the camera off. So we don't have an issue with officers not turning it on when they're supposed to turn it on. We don't have an issue with officers turning the camera off prematurely. It's all laid out in policy, which all of you can see online. Actually, if you go on our website right now, the body-worn camera policy link is on there, and it's also on Oprah Machine, I'm pretty sure, where all our policies have been Oprah'd and are posted on there. So again, our program goes above and beyond. They have to record, activate more than what the AG's directive requires. So we think that's, again, paying dividends here in a number of ways, right? So another thing we do that goes all the way back to our CALIA accreditation days, going back to the early 2010s, is we do a use of force analysis every year. So all that we're required to do by the state is every time we use anything more than procedural contact force, officers have to do a use of force report, and those totals get reported to the Ocean County Prosecutor's Office every year. That's all that's required. What we require internally here, and what we do every year, is we do a full deep dive analysis on use of force. So we look at what's the percentage of calls for service that we're using force. What types of calls, what circumstances are we using force? What level of force are we using, right? Use of force policy here requires our officers to use the lowest level of force that they possibly can to accomplish the law enforcement goal. So are we meeting that standard? Most of the time, are we using the least amount of force, right? What are the demographics of the people against whom we're using force? So when we look at the use of force incidents, how does that break down across male, female, black, white, Hispanic? That allows us to look for trends, look for places where we need to improve, and look for places where we're doing well, right? So I'll talk about the numbers from 2019 because that's the latest that we have. So in 2019, the Barnegat Police Department handled 19,351 calls for service, right? So in a calendar year, we handle just about 20,000 calls for service. Out of those 20,000 calls for service, officers used force in the Barnegat Police Department 22 times. 22 calls for service out of 20,000 is where force was used. All right, so that's, for those of you doing math at home, that is 0.11% of all calls for service. Right, a very low number, as it should be. Out of those 22 cases where force was used, about 2/3 of the time, the lowest level of force was used, which is a compliance hold. That's the lowest level of reportable force. That's about 2/3 of the time. About 20% of the time, it's a striking use of force, so hands or fists. and about 14% of the time, it's pepper spray, which 14%, sounds like a big percentage. It was 3 cases. So in 3 cases out of 20,000 cases, we used pepper spray. We talk about hands and fists. So when sometimes cops have to fight people who are fighting them, hands and fists was 5 calls out of 20,000 calls. So those are the kinds of numbers that we're talking about here. Then we can talk about the demographics. So when we look at the percentage of force that is used on different demographics in the population, we see that 12% of the time the force is used against black males or black females, black individuals. So if I look at that from just that one piece of data perspective, I might have somebody say, okay, well, Barnegat, by last estimate, is 7% black. You used force on 12% black. So you're using force disproportionately to the population. Well, when we look at the numbers a little deeper, and I'll talk about now circling back to the body cameras, one of the things we started doing here when we instituted the body camera program is the same way that some agencies will track motor vehicle stops, the age and demographics of the people that they stop for a motor vehicle violation. We do that on every single call for service through the body cam software. So every single time our officers take an official action and interact with somebody, the subject of that interaction, their demographic information goes into the body camera database. What that allows us to do is, at the end of the year, so when we're doing a use of force analysis for 2019, we're able to go in and say, okay, what was the percentage of white people that our officers interacted with? What was the percentage of Hispanic people our officers interacted with? And what was the percentage of black people our officers interacted with? That allows us to line up the interactions with the use of force so we get an actual accurate picture of, is the use of force proportionate, not to the percentage of the population, but to the percentage of the people we're interacting with. So you remember I said 12% of the use of force was against either a black male or a black female. Well, when we look at the demographics of all of our interactions through that body cam database, we find that our interactions are with 12% black and the corresponding percentages of white and Hispanic. So our use of force lines up literally to the percent with the same ratios of our interactions, which tells us that we're not using force disproportionately on any one demographic in our town. So that's kind of a detailed view of what we're doing every year to monitor use of force here and make sure that we're using it in the least number of cases possible. Now it's the second last part to that. Every single use of force here goes through an administrative review process. So that means you use force, reportable force, that information is being filled out on a report, it's going up the chain to a division commander who then reviews the body cam footage from that use of force and compares everything that was done with state law, federal law, our internal agency policies, the AG directives, and what our training guidelines are. And then we identify, was there a deficiency in the policy? Is there a deficiency in equipment? Did the officer do something wrong? And if there's a training deficiency, we can correct that. If the officer did something wrong, that immediately gets referred over to internal affairs, and I'll get to that as the last pillar. And if it's an equipment issue, if it's something that we can correct in training, these are all things that constantly get evaluated. And we're not randomly selecting use of force cases to review. Every single use of force case, every single officer who uses force, that video gets viewed in its entirety, and that gets assessed under those parameters of, was it legal? Was it within policy? Was it within training? Was everything done the right way? So the last piece of that goes to IA policy and our internal affairs process, which again is very robust here. And if we look at 2019 as an example, we hear a lot about police policing themselves and the thin blue line and the blue wall of silence. I can tell you that in 2019 there were 18 internal affairs investigations within the Barnegat Police Department. Some of those for very minor policy violations, and some of them for more serious things, right? Nothing criminal, but more serious things. I can tell you that the majority of those 18, 10 of those 18, were internally generated, meaning these were not complaints that came from outside. These were complaints in IA that were either brought to our attention by other officers or by supervisors. So the majority of the internal affairs complaints in Barnegat are generated by the police department policing our own. And the number of those that are found sustained, which in this case was 7 of the internal 10, I believe, we had things including a long-term suspension that came out of that. Which again, that information will be released under the Attorney General's new guidelines on releasing major discipline. You can go on our website right now and you can jump on our, if you look under one of the drop downs, you'll see the professional standards tag. Go ahead and click on professional standards. That'll take you to our professional standards page, which is where you would lodge a complaint, one of the many ways to lodge a complaint. But more importantly, you'll see our summaries are posted there, like they're supposed to be by the AG's directive, going all the way back to, I think we have 2014. So we've got 6 years worth of IA summaries on there that'll show you, here's how many complaints there were, here's how many were generated internally, externally, here's how many were exonerated, here's how many were sustained, and here's how many serious discipline issues we had, which under the old guidelines, now it's going to be anything more than 5 days suspension. Under the new guidelines, it's anything more than 5 days suspension. So that's about as deep a dive as we can get in a Facebook Live about what steps we take here to make sure that we're doing it right, that we identify issues and either fix them or hand out discipline where it's appropriate and continue to improve what we're doing. And again, at the end of the day, 20,000 calls for service in 2019 and force is used in 0.11% of those calls. So that is the rundown, and I'll start going through the comments. All right, so Facebook likes to pull me way back. All right, so all I can get back to is 14 minutes ago. So if you've been posting questions for more than 14 minutes, I'll be able to go in and see them and answer when we get done. Records at barnegatpolice.us, Stephen. It's on the website. Yeah, so body-worn camera recording should be public since it's paid for by the public. So body-worn camera guidelines are not do not come from us. What can be released and what can't, that comes from the AG's office and the AG's directive, and that has to be cleared through them and or the prosecutor's office. So until somebody changes the Oprah law or changes the directive, those are the rules that are set from above us. Yeah, Patrick, you hit on something that's a constant issue. Is again, it's not something that we're involved in because we don't make the decisions. That comes from above us on the policy of when they can be released, can't be released. But that's always been a concern, is balancing the public's right to know and see videos versus people's individual privacy. So again, that's laid out by the AG's directive, which is obviously available online. Sydney, feel free to send me an email or make a phone call with what math you don't think is accurate. All right, a fireworks question. So fireworks, we talked about this over the past couple of Facebook Lives. So the plan had originally been to do fireworks, and then the state said we couldn't do fireworks. So the town was in a position where they had to make a decision because they didn't want to lose the deposit. Fireworks are not cheap. So the town went ahead based on the guidance that they had from the state at the time that fireworks were not going to be allowed, and they canceled the fireworks so they could get their deposit back and not be wasting anybody's money. Now the state has decided that we can have fireworks, and that maybe we might be able to have 500 people at the fireworks. I know some places are going to go ahead and have them. My understanding is that the town has already canceled the contract, gotten their money back, and that it's too late to spool that up again and have them. So my understanding is that we will not be having fireworks. Why weren't body cams utilized all the time, every call prior to 2018? Lisa, because we didn't have them. They're a big expenditure. They're not cheap. They're $600 a piece for the body cams. The infrastructure that has to go in, the charging stations, the computer infrastructure, and what we have to pay in data storage. It's not a decision you make quickly. You'll recall, or you won't recall, I became chief in February of 2018. I'll give you the backstory on it, which I don't think anybody knows. So the body cam thing came to the surface because our officers, who are very adept at de-escalation training and are really good at solving problems without using force, were on a mental health crisis call of somebody armed with an edged weapon. And they positioned themselves really well, continued to work de-escalation, and were in a very tense, essentially standoff with this subject for over 40 minutes. And you've heard these terms like suicide by cop. It's a very real thing where people will charge at officers with a weapon, essentially forcing the officers to shoot them. This was one of those situations where the officers truly felt like it was going to go south. Every de-escalation technique they used, everything they were trying to do to get the situation calmed down, the subject would keep just spooling back into a rage and threatening officers and threatening to come at them. And this went on and on and on and on. And I don't know how many of you have ever been in a high-stress adrenaline dump scenario, but 2 minutes feels like an hour, never mind being at it for 40-plus minutes. The only reason that incident was resolved safely was because Stafford PD came over, because one of our officers had the wherewithal to call Stafford, because Stafford at the time was one of the only departments around here that had tasers. You'll remember that New Jersey was the last state out of the 50 in the union to allow officers to have tasers. And Stafford ended up using the taser on the individual to safely resolve that incident without any additional force being used. Our officers, as a result of that, I can tell you were shaken, essentially, because they were convinced that this subject was not going to let this thing be resolved without it elevating to deadly force. And the push for tasers came from the officers underneath, the street cops, who said, listen, you've got to give us another tool because we didn't have any other tools in the toolbox. And if Stafford wasn't there with the taser, they were afraid of what that might have escalated to. So in New Jersey, in order to have tasers, you either have to buy the tasers with the camera built into them, which are more expensive and are an issue because the new generation tasers don't even have them, or you have to have body cameras. So it was a good time for us to do an assessment of the whole picture and look at our technology footprint. And the town worked with us and our CFO Tom Lombarski to find the money within our budget to make that happen in 2018. So that's why you saw, among many of the big cultural changes that came in here in 2018, the tasers and the body cams were two of the biggest equipment changes that came in. So it's a great question, and that's why they weren't used before then. What's a compliance hold? Good question, Dave. So a compliance hold are things like wrist locks, arm bars. They're things that are used as a tool to try to control the body of somebody who you've told they're under arrest, but they don't want to be placed in handcuffs, so that you can safely get them into handcuffs. It's the lowest level of force that we're required to report, right? So we start with our presence, what they call constructive authority, and an officer in uniform telling you to do something. Constructive authority is not reportable. And then we have what's called physical contact, which is essentially what they reference as procedural contact. So if I tell you're under arrest and I take your two wrists and put them together and put handcuffs on you, that's not a use of force. That's not reportable. But if I grab your wrist and you start to pull your wrist away, and now I have to exert some kind of force that goes beyond that basic procedural contact, that's considered physical force, and officers are required to document and report that, and then we have to review that. And again, 2/3 of the time, that's the level of force that gets used around here, is just that lowest level of physical force. Are drugs a problem in Barnegat? That's a good question, Joan. Drugs are a problem everywhere. I've said this for a long time. I've worked in Barnegat and I've lived in Barnegat when we had the same level of drug use, drug dealing, and drug crime that goes on in a lot of other towns, and the town chose to put their head in the sand and pretend it wasn't a problem. Right? I'm talking about back in the late 80s, into the 90s, and through the mid 90s. That's not surprisingly back when we averaged a homicide a year. We had a lot of drug crime, and our crime rate was 5 and 6 times higher than it is today. We choose to address the drug problem here and go after people who are dealing drugs in the community, and that is a big part of how we keep crime down here, and why in the last full year of VCR, Barnegat had the lowest crime rate in Ocean County. That's why that happens, and I'd be happy to argue that point with anybody. Elric with the good question about Atlanta. So let me start off by saying this: the rules in Atlanta are different than the rules in New Jersey. I would say that it's really hard to say without having seen the full video in Atlanta and having seen all the evidence what the right course of action was. I'll tell you this: the system exists and is set up for a reason, right? You have a DA down there who believes, based on what he saw, that there was room for, or that charges were merited. I'm not sure how he came to that conclusion when the state agency that's investigating the shooting hadn't even completed their investigation yet. But I'm not down there, and I don't know. I know that just like everybody else in the criminal justice system, the officer is going to get his day in court and is going to get to present his side, and we're all going to learn a lot more, I'm sure, as the evidence comes out as to whether that was a legal shoot or not. Hi T, what do we attribute the 12% increase in calls to? So, there's a couple things. One, remember we're building about 100 homes a year in this town. So the population goes up every year. So more people typically is more calls for service. I don't have any data to support it, but I think anecdotally, having everybody under this stay-at-home order for such a long time, anytime, I want to say anytime, but usually if we look at long-term historic crime trends in America, we can tie usually increasing call volume sometimes to bad economics, right? We all know, we've all been there, I'm sure, in one form or another. There's no stress like money stress. So we got a lot of people out of work right now. We have a lot of people who 10, 20, 30 years of their life's effort in building a business has been in the lurch because we shut down all these businesses. So, people have been cooped up. The future's been a big question mark. There's a lot of variables. People are hurting financially. So I think just in general, tensions and stressors are up higher than they've been in a long, long time. And, it's not surprising to think that would bear out in the number of calls for service that we get. Sandra, the COVID cases that we get are true positives. If you want to, the old presumptive positive was you got a positive test. It was presumptive positive until the CDC said it was positive. They did away with that bar, so any positives that you see in Ocean County is a positive test result, either from a PCR test or saliva test. It does not include antibody testing. How often do we patrol adult communities? Diane, we patrol the whole town constantly. So 24/7, town split up into patrol districts. Officers are assigned to those districts. GPS in the cars, so the supervisors are able to go back and review at the end of the shift where the officers went. So we're able to get a look at our patrol coverage of the town. Some days when the call volume is less, they're able to do more patrolling. Some days when the call volume is high and the officers are busy running call to call, well then obviously there's less time for them to be patrolling side streets. So it's a function of a lot of things. Hi Taylor. Yep, I see your issue with Rose Hill, and what we'll do is I'll reach out to you offline, and we can have traffic take a look at that and see what we can do. Charlotte, question about Town Hall opening up. I don't know what their timeline is for doing that. I know that they definitely. I've had discussions with them where. My recommendation is err on the side of caution. If they're able to accomplish all the functions that they need to accomplish, either remotely over the phone with the drop boxes, and we don't have to be introducing people in and out, in my opinion, that's better. Again, ultimately not up to me, but I'm not sure what their timeline is on that for opening up. Charlotte, another good question. The drug arrests, if we break them down, no, there's not a monopoly on Barnegat residents versus out-of-town residents. Is there a particular area of town that's high in drug use or high in drug offenses? There's really not. We see it in all parts of town. We learned a long time ago, especially with the heroin issues and opioid addictions, that crosses all socioeconomic bounds. So, we've been to heroin overdoses in adult communities, in family communities, in $800,000 bayfronts. We've been to them everywhere in town. So it's not something that just resides in one section. Nice dodge. I like being called out, Elric. Fair enough. Angie, looking for going back to a police blotter. Yeah, it's something we've talked about doing here, and it's something that actually we had talked about in the beginning of the year, and then it's on a list of things that kind of got pushed onto the back burner with everything that happened with COVID. And then obviously sliding into the protests that went on, I didn't even touch on that, but if we talk about that, which was a really good I think example of how a community can protest, exercise their rights and their concerns, and it was done safely with no issues and no problems. So we didn't have any issues at all during that protest. The organizer worked very well with the town, and we did everything we could to support the exercise of those constitutional rights. So I think Barnegat was an example of the right way to do it. All right, this was longer than the last few. So lots of good questions tonight. Appreciate everybody's patience. With me going a little deeper into some of those statistics. If you have questions, go ahead and keep posting them up. I'll go back through the beginning like I usually do and try to answer whatever questions are in there. And it looks like based on how we've been doing this now, we'll probably go to a monthly on these, once a month. And if for whatever reason, if there's some things that change within the community and we need to do them more often, we can always go ahead and jump on and schedule one. So appreciate everybody being here tonight. Stay safe, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.